I would say probably The Guild of Thieves by Magnetic Scrolls. Partially because of the setting. It's a fantasy adventure, but it doesn't take itself too seriously, so there's a sense of humour which I think helps any text adventure. You don't want it to be too pretentious, and I wouldn't say there's a Monty Python influence, but there's definitely that kind of humour to the game in certain places. And it's also quite a large game. It's quite a complex game. The overall package was just right in terms of what you got with the game. So as a complete package, it just worked really well. The box artwork, the subject matter, the location graphics, the actual game itself, and it seemed to come out at the right time. It was probably about 18 months to 2 years into the 16-bit era in the UK, and I think that one, out of all of the games that Magnetic Scrolls wrote and out of all the UK games that were available, that's probably the one that I would say is a good example of British adventure gaming. Well, it was a number of reasons. One, I was a fan of the games. As I said, Colossal Adventure was the very first game I'd ever actually bought myself, and I pretty much bought every game that they released. So I was a huge fan of the games in general. I found them challenging, affordable, which was important at that point, because I was mid-teens at that point. So any game that didn't cost more than about £8 was good. I guess there were quite a few of them. They were releasing games about once every 6 to 9 months, which is quite prolific. And the quality was kept for quite a long period of time. I mean, after that, I was lucky enough to end up working for Rainbird, and Rainbird Software had actually published some updated compilations of their original releases, which they renamed them the Jewels of Darkness, and the second trilogy was the science fiction one that they called Silicon Dreams. And they had improved the system at that point, and they were able to put in more text. At that point, they'd also added graphics to all the games, although some people weren't too keen on the graphics, it has to be said. I personally felt they sort of added a necessary sort of splash of colour, if you like, to the display, just to make it look a little bit more appealing to people who wouldn't normally even look at a text adventure. Because, you know, you take a picture of a text adventure and it just looks like a screen of text, which of course what it is. But if you had a picture, then it might make a few other people who wouldn't normally play that kind of game actually, you know, want to have a look and see what it's all about. So I guess I knew enough about them because there'd been enough interviews in the UK press over the years, and I was working for a publisher who had recently actually stopped working with them, which was a shame, because it would have been nice to have actually met them on a professional level, if you like. But I knew enough of the guys at Rainbird who had worked with them to build up quite a lot of history on how that worked when they were working for Rainbird. And I did subsequently meet them afterwards. And again, when I worked for another software publisher, we actually worked with them on a completely different kind of game, which wasn't a text adventure at all, which is called Champion of the Raj, which was a graphic sort of strategy come adventure, which actually didn't do very well commercially at the end, and it was near the very end of the company where they actually ended up closing down probably about 6 months after we published that particular title. So I kind of realised that I had an enormous background history on the company. I had some insider knowledge on the company that hadn't necessarily been published before. And originally I wrote an article about the history of Level 9 for a adventure, I guess you'd call it a fanzine, but it was actually on disc. It wasn't a published thing, it was actually released on disc, sort of mail order only, which was being run by a friend of mine who, again, I had met through my Micronet and Prestel connection. And so I wrote quite a few articles for this fanzine called Syntax, which ran for about, I think it was about 60 issues, which is about 5 years worth. And these are on disc for the ST, Amiga and PC. So quite a few of the articles I originally wrote were based on my experiences working in the software industry, working for Rainbird, and my knowledge of Level 9. And that's where that article came from, originally from Syntax, and then I rewritten it and sort of added to it and updated it a couple of times and had the most recent version of it published about 18 months ago for a UK magazine called Retro Gamer, which covers the whole old computer scene in quite a lot of detail. And the nice thing about that was I was able to get in contact with one of the guys at Level 9, which was Mike Austin, and I actually sent him the article and just asked him if there was anything that was missing or anything that he thought was being portrayed wrongly, because the one thing I wanted to be was I wanted to be historically accurate as much as I could. And he didn't come back and correct anything at all, so I'm pretty much sure I got the history of the company sort of nailed, if you like. So yeah, that's how that article came about. For text adventures, I think the signs of them on the way out was about probably 1988, around that time. When I was working for Rainbird, we were actually working on an text adventure system, which was going to be called Rail, which was the Rainbird Adventure Implementation System, or language, sorry, Rainbird Adventure Implementation Language. And this was being written by a guy called John Jones Steele, who was actually the programmer who had co-written Level 9's system that they'd used once they moved on to the 16-bit market. So for Night Orc, Gnome Ranger, Lancelot, Scapegoat, those kinds of games. And it was like a C programming language. It wasn't a system in the same way that on the 8-bit micros in the UK we had things like the Quill, and we had the professional adventure writing system, and then we had the graphic adventure creator. We had 3 or 4 8-bit systems. They're all menu driven, and we were developing this text adventure system that we were actually going to be able to author our own games in-house, which was the one thing that a number of us really, really wanted to do. Because I think anyone who plays adventure games always has a desire at some point to actually want to create their own. And this system was in development for probably just under a year, and basically it was cancelled, I think it was the autumn of 1988. And that was around the time that I think we started seeing the graphic adventures coming out over from the States, from Sierra and people like that. And a lot of people thought that that was going to be the future for adventure games. And I can quite clearly remember seeing the first few and not liking them at all, thinking, well, that's not an adventure. You know, you're having to click on things, and it's a guy walking around. It's not really what I would call an adventure game. So I think that was the early signs. I mean, the sales of the Magnetic Scrolls games were still pretty steady at that point, from what I can recall. And in fact, quite often you'd find that a game, for example, like the first couple of Magnetic Scrolls games, like the Pawn and the Guild of Thieves, although you wouldn't see them in the top 10 sales charts that they had over here, you'd probably find that over a year or 2 year period, they have actually sold more copies than anything else. Yeah, but they just don't. They're slow burners. They sell regularly and steadily over a long period of time, mainly because text adventures don't rely on the technology. They don't have to have a faster machine. They don't have to have the witty graphics and the great sound and all that kind of thing. A text adventure can run on a very basic system. So the location graphics help, and the Magnetic Scrolls games had some very good graphics for that point in time. But I think, yeah, the late 1988 was definitely the signs of things starting to turn away from text adventures and going more towards the point-and-click things that Sierra and other people were doing. And I mean, so I didn't particularly like those. I was much more I want to type my commands in from a keyboard kind of guy, so I wasn't particularly keen on them. Yeah, I mean, you do see some. I mean, the Infocom games, it's going to be hard to actually think of a specific example, but occasionally there would be phrases, or there would be words in there, things that would sort of give it away that this is an American adventure compared to a UK one. As I said, I think a lot of UK games tended to have more humour in them, or at least that was the way that a lot of the games I saw. And I say British humour can sometimes not translate too well across the pond and vice versa, yeah. But other than that, no, I mean, I say the Infocom games were very different to anything that we had in the UK for a while, simply because I said we were running games on cassette, and a lot less memory. Everything basically had to load in one go, and because we had graphics in adventures, for example on the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 from an early stage, There are an awful lot more games with pictures rather than the Infocom approach, which was straight text and was a lot more detailed text. But I think that was because it was disc-based rather than cassette-based. So that was more obvious, but it wasn't so much a cultural thing as a technological and a cost thing. We had the Commodore 64, we had some of the early Apple machines as well, but they were very, very expensive compared to the machines that originated in the UK. So there was the Sinclair Spectrum, when it first came out, I think was £199, and as soon as the Commodore 64 came out at the same price over here, then the Spectrum dropped price to £129, for example. And a disk drive for the Commodore 64 cost as much, if not more, than the Commodore 64 itself. And we were just used to having a cheap and cheerful way of being able to use the computer, and a cassette was the way to do it. So that was part of the reasons. It was partly cost, to be perfectly honest. So as I said, a lot of the games, and also it was very much a sort of I'd say a back bedroom industry. An awful lot of people that started in games could write and publish their own games and literally release them on cassette because they had everything they needed to mass produce these things in their own house. They had a cassette deck and they had the computer. They didn't need much else. So an awful lot of cottage industries popped up within the first 2 years from the real enthusiasts, and that's just the way the industry as a whole sort of grew out. So we kind of stuck with the cassette-based games until the 16-bit era, when they were disc anyway. And I think because an awful lot of the stuff from the States was disc-based, and the cost of the machines was a lot more when they were released over here, and that's just the way it went. It was more economics than anything else, I think. Well, I can remember seeing an interview with Infocom there was a UK magazine called Micro Adventurer, which covered role-playing games, strategy games, and adventures. And they actually had an interview with the guys over in the States who were running Infocom. And because they were on, I said, I think Commodore 64 disc and Apple IIe or something, and a couple of the machines, it didn't really register with me at all, because that was hardware that A, I didn't own, and B, would never be able to afford to buy. So kind of knew about them, but didn't really know anything about the games, because not many shops in the UK stocked them. They were distributed by a very small company somewhere, so you only had like them in dribs and drabs. And of course, in the mid-80s, when Magnetic Scrolls started up, they were aware of Infocom, and I guess they were influenced by not only the style of games, if you like, but the things that came with the game as well. I mean, the Pawn, when it was first released, was actually only released for the Sinclair QL, which was sort of the business end of the Spectrum, if you like, which ran on little microdrive things that were only about that big, and it was basically like a looped bit of tape, but you know, it was almost like a disc. And it was only when Rainbird took that title on that all the extras that got put into the box as well, if you like. Because the QL version just had the adventure and I think an instruction booklet, and that was it. By the time Rainbird released all the other versions, then they were putting in a novella, a poster, things like that, not physical items. But when Guild of Thieves came out, then there were other items in there again, and gradually they started to add these things in, like you had a casino chip in Corruption, you had a Filofax book that had all sorts of clues, you had a newspaper in one of them. And so all these things kind of came along at around the same time that a lot of people in the UK were discovering Infocom properly, when they were playing the ST and the Amiga versions that were starting to be released over here. I think it might well have been by Activision at that point. So yeah, it was almost like a very well kept secret for a very select number of people who could actually afford the disk drives and the machines that originated in the States, rather than the Spectrums and the like, which were UK machines. So there was a group of people who did know about Infocom, but it wasn't as mainstream as it was in the States until the ST and the Amiga came around.
What was your perception of that as a selling point?
To be honest, it's probably the marketing departments of the publishers trying very hard to find something to say about text adventures, because it's very easy to say something's got fast-moving graphics and a full orchestra soundtrack, and runs at so many frames a second and has sideways scrolling and all that kind of thing, or parallax scrolling, whatever. But when you're talking about a text entry adventure, it's not really about the technology. Yeah, the technology is not really important. It's about the story. And I think a lot of marketing people had problems knowing how to sell this thing to people without being able to mention all the whizzy stuff that other games might have. So, you know, it's all about metrics. They need to say, well, our game's bigger than yours, or our game's faster than yours. So it became, well, our game's got 200 locations. And, you know, or our game's got 175 locations, or our game's got 7,000, which one of the level 9 games probably did have, but no one ever actually visited them all because it was basically part of a big maze on the spaceship, and you only went through one very small path of it. So it's more just about marketing having a problem trying to sell a text adventure to someone who wouldn't normally play them. And I think that's why it became important, because they couldn't really say much else other than the plot of the story of the game, and well, you type in all your commands, so you can't really say anything about the control system of the game because there isn't one. So I think it was just, you know, anything they could find to try and market the game and say it's better than another one, and the number of locations was probably about the only thing they could think of.
Okay. It really seems like it's level 9 magnetic scrolls and then a lot of homebrew. Am I missing some?
I mean, there are a couple of other companies that released games that did well over here. I said Melbourne House with Beam Software did The Hobbit. They then did Sherlock, which is a Sherlock Holmes game, and they then did a 3-part Lord of the Rings game, you know, all officially licensed and so on and so forth. Although only 2 parts were actually released in the UK and Europe, and for some strange reason the 3rd part was only actually released in North America, which is very confusing, but there we go. So, I mean, Melbourne House had also published a version of Classic Adventure. They'd also published a game called Morden's Quest, which had done quite well. There were other companies. There was one called the Ram Jam Corporation, who released 3 or 4 games. The first one was called Valkyrie 17, and they also released a game based on a Dick Francis horse racing suspense thriller book called Twice Shy, and they did another game, a fantasy game called The Terrors of Trantos. And so they had a reputation for doing adventure games as well. They were text entry, but they also had graphics, and they were laid out in a very graphical way. So there was Ram Jam, there was Beam, there was a guy in the UK called Brian Howarth, who actually wrote games that were compatible with the Scott Adams database format or of the Scott Adams games. And he actually released, I think it was 10 or 11 games in what they called the Mysterious Adventures series. It's games like The Golden Baton and Arrow of Death and Perseus and Andromeda and The Feasibility Experiment, and there's a number of other ones. And these again were text entry with simple graphics, and they were released on primarily the Sinclair Spectrum and the Commodore 64. And because his system was compatible with the Scott Adams, he actually ended up doing all the Adventure International conversions for the UK market. So all the Scott Adams games then got converted by Brian Howarth, and there was a strong link basically then between him and Scott Adams. So you're talking about probably 25 or 30 different games between the two of them there that were released in the UK as well. So yeah, I mean, as I said, there was a lot of one-off games. There was a company in Liverpool called Bug-Byte who released a game called Twin Kingdom Valley, which was originally just for the BBC. And this game had, I think, something like 175 locations, had a graphic for, I don't think it was for every location, but had a full screen graphic for a lot of the locations. And the BBC was never as big a seller in the games side of things as the Spectrum and the Commodore. The BBCs were more educational, although a lot of people bought them because their kids were using them at school. So they then converted Twin Kingdom Valley from the BBC to the Commodore 64, and that sold in quite good numbers as well. And Bug-Byte didn't last much longer than that, unfortunately. It's about the only game they did. But about 6 months ago, a website suddenly reappeared on the internet with the Twin Kingdom Valley logo, and they're actually resurrecting this game for the mobile telephone market now. And so it's coming back, you know, sort of 20 odd years after it appeared and then disappeared again. But yeah, so there are a number of other companies. I mean, there's a mail order only company that actually started up in '89, which was pretty much when commercially text adventures were starting to die off completely in the UK, run by a guy called John Wilson, and the company was called Zenobi, and it was very much a cottage business, but all the games that Zenobi released were written using the utility, the systems that you could buy off the shelf, so the Quill by Gilsoft, or the Professional Adventure Writing System by Gilsoft, or the Graphic Adventure Creator, which Incentive released over here. And so this company probably released well in excess of over 100 text adventures just through mail order alone, and they got reviews in all of the 8-bit computer magazines, mainly because the 8-bit market was starting to die off and they needed more product to review in the first place, but also because there was still adventure columns being done on a regular basis in these magazines, even though overall, commercially, they were on their way out. So Zenobi published a whole load of games that a lot of people were very happy with. I mean, one of them, I think it's called Behind Closed Doors, was literally about a guy who gets locked in his outside toilet and how he gets out, and it's an entire game literally based around one room. So things like that. So there were quite a lot of other smaller, as I say, more cottage industry businesses, and a few other ones who did dabble in text adventures. But certainly as we got through to the late 80s, the Level 9s and the Magnetic Scrolls were the main players, if you like, in the industry by then. And it then went into almost regressed back to the, as I said, back bedroom cottage industry adventures. That's how they kept going for probably another 5, 6, 7 years after everybody else had moved on. Well, it must have been about 1981. Nobody had home computers in the UK back then. There were very few of them available. They were just starting to come out, like in kit form. And a friend down the road had a Tandy TRS-80 that his dad had bought for him. And it came with 6 cassettes. There was a Defender game, there was Star Trek, there was, I think it was 3D Tic-Tac-Toe, that kind of thing. And there was one cassette called Pyramid 2000. And Pyramid 2000, I didn't know it at the time, but was a version of the classic Adventure, you know, the Crowther and Woods game. And I guess because I was, at that age, I was about, 13, and I read books all the time, so I loved books, loved sort of fantasy, science fiction, that kind of genre in terms of reading. And so a text adventure actually sort of grabbed my interest a lot more than the Defender thing, because my reactions weren't particularly fast at that kind of game. So I actually liked a game that gave you time to consider what to do next, and it was a bit like reading a book. Probably 3 or 4 weeks on and off of playing this round at my friend's house, and then we got stuck. Hadn't got a clue how to get past. I think it was actually a serpent, which is the same as in the classic adventure, and tried everything we could think of, could not get past this serpent at all. And then a mutual friend of ours was into desktop role-playing, so Dungeons and Dragons. And there was I think it must have been a convention of some kind that he'd gone along to, and everyone there was talking about text adventures because the people were starting to play these things. And he found out how to get past the serpent, but this is like probably 2 or 3 months afterwards by now. And I remember he told my friend, who then, when the next time we loaded the game up, said, "Oh, all you got to do is, catch the bird and then let the bird out the cage." And we thought, that sounds a bit strange, but yeah, we'll give it a go. And when we did it and it got us past it, it was such an achievement. It was the first time we'd really felt that we'd actually made good progress and we'd sort of beaten one of the main puzzles, or what we thought was one of the main puzzles in the game. And it's like, wow, this is actually pretty good. So, that was really what grabbed the interest, and then we went through, and I'm pretty sure we finished it probably within a couple of weeks after that. But of course, things weren't quite as immediate back then either, so there wasn't a huge network of people you could ask. There was no internet, there was no email, and very few people had computers, so very few people actually knew how to play these games and win. And it was seeing The Hobbit, which was by Beam Software in Australia, but published in the UK by Melbourne House, and seeing that there was an adventure game there, but there was also graphics, pictures, which just made it look a little bit more interesting as well. So quite often people get the impression that sort of text-only games were around for quite a long time before people suddenly had the idea of adding graphics to make them more commercial. But in the UK, they were pretty much there almost from the start in the UK industry. And so The Hobbit was the next one that really made me think, okay, I think I'm going to start saving up and get a computer, because we still didn't have one at home at that point. And I was quite fortunate in that my father was also very keen on getting a machine. And at the time in the UK, the BBC were promoting, it's almost like a computer literacy effort across the whole country, and they actually got Acorn Computers in the UK to make a computer specifically for the BBC, which was the BBC Micro. And so we bought a BBC, and probably the very first game I bought for it was a game, again it was a version of the classic adventure, but it was published by Level 9, and it was called Colossal Adventure. But as I started playing this, I was starting to map the game as well and write down everything that I'd done. And I think, again, adventure games probably appeal to people who are very methodical and very logical in the way they do things, because mapping is a huge part of playing any adventure, text adventure. And I quite enjoyed doing that and writing down all the objects and whether I'd worked out what they were for and all this kind of thing. And that's really where it started, to be honest. I think that was the point in time where I realised that I really enjoyed these things. I liked the mapping, I liked the logical problem solving, I liked the fact that you could save your progress, think about it, come back to it another day, carry on. Whereas a lot of friends of mine who were also getting into computers at the same time were far more interested in the arcade-style games. But I really wasn't that interested with those. They were fun for a while, but once the machine was switched off, I found that I wasn't really thinking about those games anymore, whereas with the adventures, I was constantly thinking about the puzzles and how to solve them. Yes, I think that's pretty much how it started for me. Before I started doing the Adventure SOS, which is what they called it on BBC Two CFAX on the teletext service, there had been a number of magazines in the UK that were already doing either a weekly or a monthly adventure helpline column, where people would write in and say, I'm stuck in this game, can anybody help? Or other people would write in and say, you know, I've solved these games, if anybody has any problems they can contact me. So it's sort of like a pen pal kind of thing going on. Yeah, basically there's a lot of magazines in the UK publish the helplines, and I'd written to a couple of them, got in contact with a couple of people who'd helped me out, and I'd also helped out in a couple of other games. And I just realised I actually had, because of buying all the magazines, excuse me, buying a lot of the magazines, and having played an awful lot of games, I had quite a lot of solutions to games, maps and all this kind of thing just sort of piled up. Hadn't conscientiously decided to sort of store them anywhere, but just realised that I had this quite big collection. And basically we moved house and got a new television with teletext on it, came across the pages on BBC Two completely by accident. I was just browsing through, trying out various things, and noticed there was a computer section, so thought, well, this might be interesting. And there was a request from the editor of the teletext service from the BBC for people to write in with games reviews. Now, I quite like the idea of writing in some way for a living. I wasn't sure how I was going to do it, but at that point I thought, oh, well, this might, you know, open up some avenues, because it's writing and it's to do with computer games, which I was really interested in. So I basically sent in a couple of reviews, and they had to be very short, because obviously you haven't got that much space on the television screen. In teletext it's like 3 paragraphs, and that's 1 page. Yeah, and I just happened to add as a footnote at the bottom of the letter that if they wanted to cover adventure games, I'd be willing to help out. The next thing I know, the editor actually phones me up and says, well, actually, you know, would you like to write a regular column on adventures? Because I said at that point there were quite a few on the market, most of them UK-based, mainly because we couldn't afford the disk drives, to be perfectly honest. On the old 8-bit micros, everything in the UK and I think probably Europe was on cassette rather than on disc. So a lot of people hadn't actually got experience of Infocom yet, because they were disc only. So we had an awful lot of cassette-based games. But there were a lot of them, and he said, well, actually, you know, we think there's probably enough of a demand out there to make this a regular column. said, well, we'll give it a go for a couple of months and see how it goes. So they sent me some software in the post, which allowed me to create the teletext pages. We still had our BBC Micro, because the BBC Micro, fortunately, because it's the BBC, has a teletext mode. So it was very easy to create teletext pages with the right software. So they gave me the software, and I basically created probably the first two columns, if you like, because they put out a request, and they got a pile of posts which is probably about this high of letters straight away within a week of the page going out. And they posted all these letters to me, and that pretty much gave me enough things to keep the column going for the first couple of months. And it was all people stuck in games. Because, okay, it wasn't email, so it wasn't instant, because obviously we still weren't quite with email, and the internet wasn't there yet. But for a lot of people, it was the only way they could get themselves out of a hole. And that's really how it started. We tried it out for 3 months, got enough posts coming in to the BBC for them to decide that this was worth doing. It went out, sometimes it was every 2 weeks, a new one would be issued, and sometimes it was every 3. But basically it remained on air throughout that 2 or 3 week period before we changed it for the next one. So I think in total it lasted about 18 months. It probably ended around the time that the ST and the Amiga were starting to pick up, which probably coincided with when Text Adventures was starting to wane, commercially at least. So the two were probably coincided, because we got less posters as time went on. The interesting thing was that I was posting these discs back to the BBC for the first couple of months, and then they said, well, actually there is a better way of doing this. If you subscribe to Prestel or Micronet, then you can send them to me electronically. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting, you know. Obviously, the precursor email, effectively. In terms of the types of puzzles that people got stuck on, there wasn't really a pattern that I could see. I mean, some people would get stuck on, you know, what other people call trivial problems, and it would turn out to be because they were using the wrong verb or noun, for example. Because one of the things that used to drive a lot of my friends crazy who weren't into adventures was that half the time it wasn't so much the puzzles you were trying to get around as the vocabulary that the author of the game had decided to use for that particular puzzle. So as we moved into the 16-bit era, for example, the vocabulary was enlarged, and there was a lot more, loads of different words that you could use, basically. So that there are lots of other ways of solving a puzzle. Yeah. So I wouldn't say there was a common type of one. I think probably the Babelfish in Hitchhiker's Guide was one that really caused people a lot of problems because we all knew Hitchhikers. Well, a lot of the people that played that game knew Hitchhikers. And obviously when Infocom got Douglas Adams to do the game, they expanded on it because it would be pretty pointless if you just did the same things that the character did in the book or in the TV series or whatever. And so the whole... I mean, there's about 6 or 7 different things, if I remember rightly, that you have to do in order to get the Babelfish and actually be able to translate the Vogon. And I think that one was the one that always stuck in my mind, just the sheer number of things you had to do to be able to catch this thing and stick it in your ear, which sounds kind of ludicrous when you think about it now, and sounds even more ludicrous when you explain to someone who doesn't actually know what you're talking about. But I think that one was the one that stuck in my mind most from that era.
So I guess what I'm asking is for, as best you can give it, a history of, Level 9.
Right. Okay. Well, Level 9 is a family, or was a family company. There were 3 brothers, Mike, Nick and Pete, and basically they started up in 1981 using I think it was a 16K NASCOM computer and not much money, and were writing various compilers and a few arcade games and so on and so forth. And one of the brothers saw the original adventure game running on a mainframe at a bank that he was working at the time, and thought they could fit that game into 16K. That was the challenge. And so basically Pete Austin wrote an adventure system, Mike Austin wrote this language which they called A-Code, and then Pete wrote some compression routines to actually compress the text down as much as they could. And they basically wrote Colossal Adventure as a test to see whether they could do it. And it was originally available for, I say it was a 16K NASCOM, a BBC Micro, a couple of other machines, but not too many. And initially just sold it through mail order, adverts in the back of whatever the magazines were at the time. And gradually, over a fairly short period of time, they realised that they were selling quite a lot of these games. They were producing an awful lot of them, and it was actually something that they could probably do as a business. And so they basically set up Level 9 Computing. They were based in High Wycombe in the UK, which isn't too far outside of London, and started to convert Colossal Adventure to run on a whole number of other machines, including Spectrum, Auric, say Dragon 32, I think. There was a number of different machines that this game came out on. And once they had got that game out of the way, then decided that they were going to need to come up with some new adventure scenarios. So first of all wrote Adventure Quest, which was what they call the second in their Middle-earth trilogy. No direct links to Tolkien, but obviously you've got orcs and elves and all that kind of thing, so they called it the Middle-earth trilogy. And this was a direct sequel to Colossal Adventure. And again, it was written using the A code, and they had the system written already, so it didn't actually take them too long, so a lot of the time was spent just designing the game. And once Adventure Quest was again released, sold very well, again they started to spread it out onto even more different machines, and then decided to release a science fiction text adventure to go in a different direction, which they called Snowball. And at that point they'd realised that about a third to a half of the people that were playing their games were actually women. Text adventures seem to appeal to women almost as much as they appeal to guys. So basically they wrote this game with a character called Kimberly, who was deliberately there was no reference to their gender, so it could be a male or a female, because they thought that would appeal more to women players and guys wouldn't necessarily notice. And Snowball was the infamous game that they quoted had 7,000 locations, and a lot of those locations were because of this maze on the spaceship, and but there was only a small part of it that you actually had to go through. But it's basically like a thriller, a science fiction thriller. It was quite a serious, straight-laced adventure game. And again, this game sold very well, did very well, but there was a distinct change in the industry, because the computing industry in the UK had started to gather momentum. Although there weren't quite so many machines, they didn't have to convert their games to quite so many different formats, but machines like the Spectrum, the Commodore, the Amstrad were selling in a lot bigger numbers. And although adventures were selling very well, they weren't selling as well as the arcade games and everything else that was out there at the time. So they made the decision that not for their next game, but for the game after, they would actually introduce graphics for the first time, but still try and fit them into, I think 48K was the smallest amount of memory they had to play with at that point. So whilst they were writing their next game, which was originally called Time Lord and ended up being released as Lords of Time, they were planning on going the next step and actually making their games illustrated, was the phrase they used. And so for Lords of Time, they actually brought in a fan of their previous games to actually help them design the game, someone called Sue Gazzard. And so she actually helped them design this game that had, it was called Lords of Time. It had lots of references to the number 9 in it, so the 9 time zones and 9 evil time lords and that kind of thing. And obviously they're level 9, so that there's a sort of a theme going through the game. But that was their last text-only game that they developed. The next game that they developed was the sequel, or the follow-up to Snowball, and this game was called Return to Eden. And Return to Eden was inspired by a whole number of different science fiction novelists, like Isaac Asimov and Brian Aldiss, Piers Anthony, I think Larry Niven, people like that. And they actually state this in the information that they supply with the game that there are various influences on the game design, which is quite interesting because a lot of people, as I said before, if they play text adventures, they tend to be people that like reading books as well, so it actually might inspire people to go off and read some classic science fiction. But Return to Eden had graphics for the first time, but what they did was they actually created a system which was almost like an identikit. So you'd have a tree, a boulder, various different things that were drawn as separate items, and then they'd be placed in different places on the screen, and then the picture would be revealed, and that's your location. And the one thing about the pictures is you can turn them off and it doesn't affect the game at all. So they're only for illustration purposes. There are no clues in the pictures. There's nothing that you have to know in the picture to enable you to solve the game. But it made them more commercial, basically. They needed the games to try and be more mainstream, and they thought that pictures was the way forward. And some people didn't like them, and some people said they were fine. They look better on some formats than on others, for example. So basically they did Return to Eden, followed that up with one of the games that was going to be part of a cheaper range. There was a game called Emerald Isle, which again they got designed by someone who wasn't actually part of the Level 9 team, so it was an external person. And it was a much smaller game, and in theory it was a much simpler game, although it was actually still quite a difficult game to finish. But it was actually released as a cheaper game. And it was almost like a stopgap between Return to Eden and the next game they released, which was going to be Red Moon. And Red Moon was a fantasy game, and it was involving magic, and it also involved something that they hadn't put into any of their games before, which was this idea of hit points. So there's a very, very small element of like role-playing games coming in here, where you'd be a character and other characters that would wander around the game would actually hit you and reduce your hit points. And again, I'm sure this was probably done to make it slightly more commercial. But it was still a text adventure at its heart. It had location graphics in the same way that Return to Eden had the identikit approach. And it sold very well. It got good reviews. It was quite a tricky game in places, but it was still a good adventure. And at the same time as they were doing these, they actually started to farm out some of their expertise to other publishers, because up till now they'd published everything themselves. They'd handled the whole lot: marketing, production, everything. And they started to do games for other companies. So they actually produced a game for a company called Mosaic, based on Terry Jones from Monty Python, based on his novel Eric the Viking, which Terry Jones made into a film as well a couple of years after the novel came out. And so they released this adventure, which basically used the same system, but was actually published by somebody else. It's the first time they'd done that. And it didn't sell particularly well, but it did well enough for them to be hired again to produce two other games for the same publisher that were based on a series of books by a lady called Sue Townsend, which was Adrian Mole, which were all about a young boy, teenage boy, growing up in the UK. It's a very humorous kind of series of books that did very well over here. And but this time it was a multiple choice thing. It wasn't really text entry in it as such. It was displayed in the same way as all their other games, but you actually had a series of options as to what to do next. So it's almost like the fighting fantasy books that you could buy, where you chose what you wanted to do next and then turned to page whatever and carried on like that. So it's a slight departure, but it was actually the thing that they released that sold more copies than anything else. Partially, I think, because of the Adrian Mole link, and they actually felt that a lot of people who wouldn't normally play a text adventure were actually happier being given a choice of 3 or 4 things that they had to do next to be able to progress in the game. So they actually did 2 Adrian Mole games, which sold sort of like 100, 200,000 copies or something, which for Level 9 was very, it's good business. And so they developed their last original 8-bit game called The Price of Magic, which was the follow-up to Red Moon, and again was basically about a wizard, and it was in a fantasy setting, and it didn't have the hit points that Red Moon had before it, but this time it had an element where basically the price of magic is your sanity. So there were various levels of how sane you were. As you started the game, you were perfectly sane, and depending on how things panned out during the game, you could end up almost going completely insane by the end. And in fact, the one thing they had at the very end of the game was, when you finished the game, you actually had a choice of a good or a bad ending. The good ending was that you saved the land and everything was fine and dandy. The bad ending was that you actually ended up going completely mad and ended up in a lunatic asylum, which was an interesting kind of choice at the very end of the game. And of course, you could go mad long before you got to the end if your sanity had dropped to a certain point, depending on how the game went. Now, at that point, Level 9 started to get really keen on the idea of producing a multi-user game. So a bit like Mud or Shades on Micronet or Prestel. They'd been playing these Mud games for a while and actually quite liked the idea. In fact, they went as far as developing or starting to develop a game system that they were going to call Avalon, which was going to be run using networked Commodore Amigas and was also going to be run via BT, because they'd recently signed the contract with Telecomsoft, Rainbird, to produce a series of adventures for Rainbird. And they spent about a year or so developing this, and for various reasons that have never been completely clear, but probably technical and cost at the end of the day, Avalon was abandoned. But it did kind of resurface when they released their 16-bit games for Telecom, because Nighthawk, which was the first game they released, which was a 3-part game that was released on the 8-bit and the 16-bit systems. And Nighthawk actually had elements of almost like emulating a multi-user environment. So it's almost like it's a standalone game, but you're almost playing in a multi-user game. So you had people running around, you had people shouting things in the distance, saying, you know, has anyone seen that orc, for example? And it felt like it was Mud that you were playing, even though it was a standalone game. And the significant thing about the system that they used, which they sort of dubbed it Chaos, which was sort of a muddled up acronym for the Nighthawk Adventure System, was that all the puzzles were going to be based around cooperation. So, you know, in order to get anything done, you had to enlist the help of other characters. So, for example, the first part of the 3-part game was based upon the idea of getting this rope and being able to get across a chasm or a bridge with this rope. And you needed 10 pieces of rope. There are various bits of rope that you could get from various places. But to actually do some of the puzzles, you actually had to get lots of characters doing the same thing at the same time to be able to progress. So they kind of changed their approach. The games up to that point had been very much solo things. And so the Chaos system allowed them to create a multi-user environment, but it's still a text adventure game. It had digitized pictures rather than the drawn identikit approach that they had earlier. And this was a system that they were basically basing their future on, if you like. Now, at the same time, it was quite a difficult time for Level 9 in regards to them working for Telecom. There were issues either side. I think there was a lot of bugs, there were lots of delays, and because Rainbird Telecom also published the Magnetic Scrolls games, there might have been a bit of conflict in regards to Magnetic Scrolls were getting more of the publicity and more of the focus than Level 9, because you could almost say that the two were competing with each other even though they were being published by the same publisher. So Level 9 basically split from BT and went back to producing their own titles for the next game, which was a slightly tongue-in-cheek game called Gnome Ranger, which again used the Chaos system and had digitized pictures, was 3 parts, and was very similar. It had a slightly multi-user feel and required cooperation from other characters in the game to be able to fix the puzzles and so on and so forth. After Gnome Ranger, they then produced 3 other games using the same system. One was Time and Magic, which was a compilation, an updating of 3 of their previous games, which was Lords of Time, Red Moon, and The Price of Magic. And that compilation was actually originally going to be published by Rainbird, but ended up being published by a company called Mandarin. And then Mandarin also published a couple of other games of theirs. One of them was called Lancelot, which was based on the famous Lancelot, King Arthur, and all that kind of thing. And again, it was a 3-part game. And then they ended up producing what was their last text entry adventure in 1989, which was called Scapegoat, which was a modern-day setting, was actually about a detective who gets murdered and comes back as a ghost and has to actually solve who killed him. And it was actually an interesting scenario. I don't think anyone had done a game in in that genre or that type before. But again, it used the Chaos system, and it was 16-bit, and it had the location graphics and so on and so forth. But at that point, the adventure game market was pretty much dying on its feet. It didn't really sell in huge numbers. And so Level 9 changed direction and basically switched to a sort of graphical strategy point-and-click style system. So if you were to think of Cinemaware and Defender of the Crown, it was a similar sort of approach where you had a little bit of strategy and a little bit of action, but it was all graphical. So they basically moved away from text adventures and went to this new system, which was what they called their Huge system, which was the wholly universal graphic engine. And they produced one game that was published using the system, which was Champion of the Raj. They were working on a second game for a publisher called Ocean, who it was based on Billy the Kid. And the game was pretty much finished, but Ocean never released it. And in fact, a version did appear on the internet. A German language version was floating around on the internet a few years ago. And they did also do a PC conversion for Cinemaware of It Came from the Desert, because their system was very similar to the type of games that Cinemaware developed. That Cinemaware actually engaged Level 9 to do a conversion to the PC for It Came from the Desert. But that was the last product that they actually ended up producing. They laid off almost everyone that worked for them in the autumn of '91, and they pretty much disappeared by the end of 1992. And that is it, basically.
Okay.